Hey Rebels, my name is Matthew Barton. Welcome to the Rebellion Brewing Podcast. 2021 was a rough year for barley. Experts in the beer industry are saying climate change means longer, hotter, drier summers. That isn't great for beer. Ottawa's recent announcement about nitrogen use and greenhouse gas emissions led to a lot of outrage online. But some of it didn't make sense to me, and the heated rhetoric didn't match what I've heard from farmers in the past. Today, I'm sitting down with local agronomist Thom Weir to unpack the nitrogen dust-up and figure out what this all means for the beer industry. So let's get into it. Thom, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
I guess let's start at the beginning. What is your background when it comes to agriculture?
Well, my background, I guess, is my life. I grew up on a grain farm in west central Saskatchewan. From there, I attended university in Saskatoon and graduated in 1976 with my Bachelor of Science in Agriculture. From there, I have spent my whole working career in agriculture, and for most of the last 30 years as a field agronomist in various positions with a couple of different companies.
When it comes to setting the stage for this discussion, for this episode, let's start at the beginning. And can you explain to me why nitrogen is so important for farmers?
Well, of the nutrients that we think of in crop, and I guess for a urbanite going down and buying a bag of fertilizer for their lawn, we think of four major nutrients. There's nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, and sulfur. And then there's what's known as micronutrients. But in the big scheme of things, nitrogen is the yield driver. It accounts for probably 80% of the yield that a farmer gets. So of the big four, it's by far the mega nutrient, shall we say, that drives the yield of a crop.
What are some of the costs associated with using these nitrogen products in our soil?
Well, there's costs and there's benefits, I guess. The overall cost is buying the fertilizer, and there's various forms of nitrogen, but a normal application on a cropland may run a grower $80 to $100 or $150 an acre for the fertilizer that he's putting in the ground. From an environmental standpoint, and I guess nitrogen, if anybody wants to look a little bit closer at it, we know there's various cycles that are talked about from an environmental standpoint. We've got the water cycle, we've got the carbon cycle, we've got various nutrient cycles. Nitrogen is kind of unique in that it's I'll call it leaky. There are numbers of ways that nitrogen can get into the system, and there's various ways that it leaves the system. So it's a complicated cycle, and different environmental conditions will cause different reactions of that nitrogen in the soil. The first thing you got to understand with nitrogen is that 80% of the air that we breathe is nitrogen. So from a novices or uninformed standpoint, figure great, there's all this nitrogen around us. And nitrogen as nitrogen gas does not cause greenhouse gas issues. It's very benign. But when we start looking at the cycle, the nitrogen cycle, we see that there's a couple of losses that do mechanisms that do impact the environment. And one is the gassing off of ammonia gas. And this occurs through a couple of reactions. But when we broadcast a common nitrogen fertilizer, or if we band it shallowly, below or above 2 inches, urea will react with an enzyme in the soil, and ammonia gas will then be created, and it gasses off into the atmosphere. Now, ammonia gas is a greenhouse gas, or does become a greenhouse gas. So that's not good. The second and the major area that is of concern from an environmental standpoint is that as nitrogen enters the soil as an ammonium-based fertilizer, so that could be urea or anhydrous ammonia, it's very stable. But then we turn around and get a reaction. Microbes will break down the nitrogen and move it towards nitrate. Once it becomes nitrate, it is quite, I won't call it volatile, but it can change very quickly into a number of different other products. And one of them is nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide is a 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide greenhouse gas. So it's our major focus when we're talking about negative aspects of nitrogen. On the other hand, we got positive aspects. That work that's being done by an organization called soils.org that are trying to lay down ways of testing soil health, have come out and said that the number one factor for improving soil health is the application of nitrogen fertilizer. So it becomes a balance. We've got, if it's not used correctly, we can get the greenhouse gases being produced. But if it is used correctly, it goes a long way to improving our soil health.
One of the reasons I wanted to bring you on is because a few weeks ago, I saw a lot of loud, angry videos, a lot of shouting on Twitter, and they're railing against these massive forces. But I also want to throw it out there. I don't think farmers are a monolith, and I want to give credit where credit's due, because in the past, I've talked to farmers about soil management and no-till. I've been shown topographical maps of farmers' fields where they're managing chemical application and inputs because they want to reduce their input costs. They want to do targeted fertilization. They want to do this thing smarter and use more technology to basically fundamentally save money, increase yields, and have better outcomes. Where do you think farmers have done this really well?
Well, if you look at it, I was involved in the late 80s, early 90s. I worked for a fertilizer company called Wesco, and one of the things that we did was work with a number of manufacturers to develop fertilizer application with reduced or no-till and direct seeding. And that has probably been one of the greatest steps forward from an environmental standpoint. The minute you till soil, you disturb the environment, but you churn up the organisms that break down the organic matter, which is where carbon is stored, and it converts it into usable elements like nitrogen, but it also in the process gives off carbon dioxide. So the whole aspect of direct seeding and no-till started in the mid 80s and really ramped up by the mid to end of the 90s. And research has shown that by doing this, farmers are able to, over a number of years, put back in the organic matter that for years they've been mining out of the soil. If we go back to, say, when the soil was first broken in say 1900, the tillage allowed the growers to produce really good crops without the application of fertilizer other than manure. But over the next 100 years, we saw a depletion of the organic matter and the requirement to add synthetic fertilizers. So now we're able to, through the application of these fertilizers, actually replace some of the organic matter that was taken out of the soil. And we've seen situations where 50% of the organic matter has been reintroduced into the soil. So that's been a really big step forward. And as you say about economics, that was driven by economics. Growers, if you in the mid 80s, early 90s, the fuel costs went way up, and they wanted a way to save money, and the way to save money was to reduce the tillage costs. At the same time, some of the herbicides that were required for no-till, the price came way down on them, and so all of a sudden it became economic to direct seed. The thing was, it wasn't done from an environmental standpoint. The environmental sequestering of carbon dioxide into the soil through organic matter was a positive side effect.
Given what we saw last year, the kind of the trend lines in terms of climate, it's my understanding farmers are kind of on the front line of climate change. It's going to affect their bottom line probably first before any other industry.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Okay. Is there a need, do you think, or do you see from farmers when you talk to them, to manage emissions aggressively?
Well, I guess the thing is, in a lot of cases, most people are adverse to change. So they want to see a status quo, and so that's just natural. And I guess a lot of them point at other industries and say, well, yeah, but they've got, that's where the emissions are coming from. Don't bother us. Agriculture accounts for about 10% of the emissions. So it's not small and innocuous. It is significant. Of that 10%, about a third of it, so about 3.5%, comes from crop production. And I guess the situation is, we all want our grandchildren and their grandchildren to have a place to live. And when you're on the farm, you think you're doing the best for that. But I think we have to get to look at ourselves and say, are there areas that we can do better? And we just talked about no-till. And I've had that thrown at me by a number of farmers saying that, well, I'm no-tilling, so I'm doing a good job. The fact is that we're in a situation where about the same amount of carbon dioxide is sequestered or put back in the soil by reduced tillage as is emitted by nitrogen in the form of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. So although you may be no-tilling and sequestering carbon, you may be also emitting from less than optimum applications of nitrogen and use of nitrogen. that much back into the system. So it's not a simple answer, but I think farmers, they've got to take a bit of a deeper look and quit patting themselves on the back and saying, I'm doing a good job because I'm no-tilling, because there's the other side of the equation that they have to look at.
I guess flowing from what you just said, when we say what are the next steps for farmers, we look at what Ottawa's recent announcement was, where they're going to subsidize or incentivize reducing your emissions output, whether that's by reducing your use of nitrogen or adopting new techniques or investing in new technology. What was your initial impression of this announcement?
I think it's exciting. I guess for a couple of reasons. One is there's always the carrot and the stick scenario, where are they going to use the carrot, which they seem to be looking at, or use the stick, where they put restrictions on the application of nitrogen fertilizers. So I think that's positive that they're using the carrot scenario. Secondly is growers can utilize new technologies to actually make more efficient use of their fertilizer, reduce their fertilizer costs potentially, and come out winners, just the same as with no-till. As growers started using it, they realized that, hey, I can actually grow more grain at a reduced cost by using no-till. So, technologies like variable rate fertilizer. Now, I've been working in that field for over 10 years for about.
Assume I'm a dumbass. Talk to me like I'm 6. What is variable rate fertilization?
What variable rate does is, through a number of different systems, but basically, say using a satellite image, using spectrums of the satellite, and coming up with what a biomass growth, it's called NDVI. I won't get into that, but what they do is they break the field up into zones that are more homogeneous. So the idea then is you take those zones, you soil sample those zones independently, and then you come up with a prescription for each zone. Now, the technology that we have today allows you to put the prescription into an apparatus on the tractor, and when you're going down the field, it realizes where you are in the field, and it looks at the prescription, and it'll change the fertilizer rate as you go across that field. So what that does is makes a more precision application. One of the problems of nitrous oxide emissions is it occurs most when there's excess nitrogen.
So you're trying to thread that needle.
Exactly, and so it becomes an art work based on science to come up with this balance and putting on the right amount of nitrogen for that specific area.
We're looking at these targeted maps with targeted ratios for fertilizer to kind of thread the needle and get the right amount at the right time in the right place.
Exactly. And so one of those things, and I guess I'm just going to take a second now and relate that back to, I know your love is beer, and beer is made out of barley. And so how that becomes beneficial for barley production is we have a target in barley of around 10.5 to 11% protein. Too much protein, and you get a very foamy beer and a cloudy beer. So we have to be careful when we're growing the barley. So by protein, the amount of protein is directly proportional to the amount of nitrogen. So if we have a constant relevant rate of nitrogen, that ends up making a lower protein on that field, and we're better able to target the protein to make better beer.
Right.
When I talk to growers about variable rate, I say, okay, there's 3 different goals that you can look at before we start coming up with a prescription. One is, do you want to grow more with optimum rates of nitrogen, which may be a higher application rate across the field? Or do you want to target growing the same with less nitrogen? Or do you want to pick out an economic target, and we'll make a prescription that'll target that on an economic basis, the application? So when we know we can do it, we've done trials and have seen consistently with nitrogen that you can grow the same amount of crop using less nitrogen. So that works right into this idea of reducing 30% of emissions without hurting the yield. Now, it may not be 30% depending on the field, but it could be 10%. So that's a step forward on the application of the same amount of fertilizer growing more crop, or using the same yield and using less nitrogen. A way of achieving that reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
In my mind, that says to me, Rome wasn't built in a day, but if we're moving in the right direction to reduce emissions and preserve yields, then we're not negatively impacting, say, the yield of barley, and then impacting the price of beer.
Exactly. And I mean, you're right. It's small steps that we have to move towards. Variable rate applications is just one. Another is there are new forms of nitrogen fertilizer, and some of them have built into them chemicals that will inhibit the conversion of urea to that ammonia gas, so that it chemically prevents that enzyme from working. So by applying that to your urea fertilizer and then putting it in the ground or even on the surface, we can have a better chance of getting a rain and moving it down into the soil before we have losses.
So we create this product with, like, let's say, for example, the Haber-Bosch process. We create this product that you can put on the field. But we've said to scientists, we need to reduce emissions. They go into the lab, they improve upon that process, create a new product that creates fewer emissions.
Exactly. And we've got that's just one of the products. We have what's called denitrification inhibitors, which I talked earlier about the product being converted to nitrate, and then the bacteria actually use the nitrogen, but they rob the oxygen off of it, and for lack of a better word, they fart out nitrous oxide. And so there are chemicals that will reduce that conversion.
We talk a lot about organic matter farting out in brewing. Like during the fermentation process, we had to install new fans in the brewery because they're pushing out so much CO2 from the tanks. You could smell it, and it was impacting the air in the brewery. We had to meet safety specs. We had to adapt. We had to adjust.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Although we're talking nitrous oxide
yeah.
in soils, which is 300 times more potent. Nitrous oxide on the other side is laughing gas. So maybe that's farmers don't get real upset because they spend the time in their field and they're inhaling the laughing gas. But anyways, and we've also designed fertilizers with different coatings that will reduce the emissions off out of that nitrogen until because it holds the nitrogen in the coating until it's really needed, and then the nitrogen is moved into the system. So we've got a number of different innovative products that are coming out that are going to allow growers to better able to manage their nitrogen emissions. The other side of it is just knowing what how we can do this. And Fertilizer Canada, an industry organization, came out with, and this would have been about 10 or 12 years ago, they call it the 4R nutrient management strategy. There's the right rate, right time, right place, and right source. So those are the 4 R's for nutrient management. And they have, for each of your nutrients, well, there's a specific best management practice, which basically these are for the use of that. And I think the strategy of the industry is know what the best management practices are for nitrogen, what are the best management practices to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. And for instance, we talked about variable rate fertilizer. Basically, that's the right rate. Going out and soil testing in those different zones and applying the right rate for the yield of the crop that you're growing. The time, the right time. Now, there are some products that there's higher losses if it's applied in the fall. So by applying the right product in the fall, and that becomes the right source, and using the best management practices to apply that product at the right time in the fall, you'll reduce emissions.
So where did all the outrage online come from? Because I thought this was farmer driven. They want to do the 4 R's, they want to save money, they want to increase profit and yields. Like, I don't understand where the pushback came from.
It became a political animal, shall we call it? I mean, really, it's the philosophy that anything that comes out from Ottawa is bad and evil, and you'll have people within governments saying 4R nutrient management is great. We support it. We're going to work with it, and then turn around in the next statement and say we see Ottawa as being evil because they're asking us telling us to reduce fertilizer use by 30%. And it seems that a lot of the farmer organizations and prairie governments are taking that stance, and they're trying to substitute the concept that they're telling us to reduce fertilizer by 30% rather than talking about the emissions from fertilizer by 30%. And it's become a real political football between the two philosophies, and there's a lot of misrepresentation being thrown back and forth.
30% reduction in use and 30% reduction in emissions is not the same thing. There's a very important distinction between those two things.
Exactly. And I just talked about situations where you can use the same pounds of nitrogen and use it properly and get more or the same amount of more yield, or you can cut back the fertilizer and get reduced emissions and not hurt your yield. The other downside is that these products do cost some money, and there are going to be situations where a grower can adopt some of these newer ideas and actually reduce his price. I know, again, going back to the variable rate, I've worked with farmers that at the end of the day have reduced their fertilizer bill, their nitrogen bill, and not hurt their yield at all. In fact, maybe even improve their yield. So that's where the idea of incentives is really sweet. It allows a grower to say, okay, I can now afford to pay a company to do my variable rate prescriptions, or I can afford to go out and buy some of this higher priced ESN fertilizer, which is environmentally smart nitrogen. It's what ESN stands for, and use that on my farm. I've wanted to use this new technology, but I just haven't seen the dollars and cents. But now if the government is creating incentives that is paying for it, and I noticed along with the government announcement, Canola Council has a program where they're going to have incentives paid to the farmer for their canola land. So these are all really positive strides as far as I'm concerned. Growers can look at their situation, figure out what's best for them, and hopefully in the end of the day, it's not going to cost them a whole bunch of money. They're going to grow more and with less emissions.
Do you see the outrage that happened a few weeks ago as just a blip? Do you think it will go away, or do you think it is going to have some long-lasting impact on what's happening with farmers and markets?
I don't know. I mean, when we're in strange times, when you see the outrage that seems to be continuing from certain groups about the COVID restrictions and stuff like that, long past the
existence of the restrictions.
Of the restrictions, I don't have a crystal ball to be able to see if some of these farmers can look beyond what their less than accurate information that they're being provided to agree with science and put it in my mind is, do we want a world that our grandchildren and their grandchildren can farm in and enjoy the bounties that we have, or I mean, if we don't stop the way we're going, and I'm not talking about whether it's climate change that's created by humans or not, but climate is changing, and it seems like CO2 levels impact it. Can we afford not to try and do something to stop it? To me, this. I mean, I've lived a pretty good life already, but my grandchildren are just starting out, and hopefully, as I said, their grandchildren will have a place that they can enjoy too. So I guess let's step beyond the political rhetoric and take a look and see what if there is a common goal out there.
I mean, I want to circle back to beer for a moment, and we see the price of a pint creeping up. When I started a few years ago at Rebellion, I think it's been about 5 years, we were looking at about $6.25 for a basic pint, and now we're seeing prices creep upwards of $7.50, $8 for a pint. Some places are charging $13 for a pint. And I think that all comes back to what's happening with, the world, not just climate change, the war in Ukraine. We look at it kind of the whole big global ecosystem, the big picture. And my thoughts drift to last year's drought. 2021 was a rough year for barley. We see 30 to 60% increases in barley costs. I got to talk to a farmer last week who grows barley and for malting, and he told me it's very nuanced across the province, and you can't paint with one brush. He said some people are still really hurting and need lots more moisture. He said some people need things to dry out, while others are kind of in the slot and they're having a great year. But he said we really won't see things smooth out for like 2 more years. And in my mind, I'm like, damn, I just want some predictability to make sure the price of a pint stays very affordable, right?
Yeah, and okay, to kind of put that into perspective, where I live, East Central Saskatchewan, used to be a very major barley production area. We were known for 6-row production mainly out here. 6-row at the time used in U.S. beers. I mean, Budweiser. There was a lot of train loads of barley shipped down to Anheuser-Busch from this area. Things have changed. 6-row is not in vogue anymore. But guys can produce 100 bushel barley out in this country. But the way things have gone in the last 10, 15 years, barley has become almost a specialty crop in this area. There are still guys growing barley for feed, but for malt, it's getting pretty few and far between to find a guy that's growing amount of barley. And last year, with the price going up early, a lot of guys grew barley, and it failed. It was the least productive of the crops under drought conditions that we've had last year. So I think that there's been more of a fundamental change in the production of barley, and it's almost retreated to west central Saskatchewan and into central Alberta for the production of barley. And what that has meant is that because it's concentrated, and for the last 3 years concentrated in a drought area of west central Saskatchewan and southwest Saskatchewan and eastern Alberta, where a lot of malt grows. I mean, think of where the malt plants are. All of a sudden, the impact of the drought has been a lot higher than it would have been a dozen years ago, where the production of malt barley was spread out more across the prairies.
Man, these things I never thought about until I got into beer.
Yeah. So I don't know, if we can get some more stability in the market. I mean, I've looked at some barley crops this year that is being grown in this area for malt, and they're doing great. But it's just that the number of growers that actually are growing malt is way down from what it was 15 years ago.
Right. At the end of the day, in my mind, I want farmers to be wildly successful. I know that we have the technology and the resources and the people to make the best crops in the world, and we can turn it into kick-ass beer and keep winning awards. And I'm always trying to find what is true. Not necessarily simple, comforting answers, but I want to find the nuanced truth of the issue. And that's what I was trying to understand with fertilizer here today. And I want to thank you, because I feel like I've learned more than I had coming into the discussion.
Good. Well, I've tried to provide, as best as I know, an unbiased view of the way. I mean, as I said a while ago, nitrogen emissions is not a straightforward answer. I mean, there's a lot of nuances. There's a lot of tricks. But I guess one thing I'd like to leave with any grower that might be listening to this is, if you're not a part of the solution, you're a part of the problem. And so, just if you're no-tilling, as I said earlier, basically that's half the battle, but there's the other half. And so I think you've got to really not sit on your laurels and argue that we should be compensated for what we've done in the past. I don't think that's going to work. I don't think there's going to be compensation for growers. Alberta growers are lucky that their government was proactive and put a program in. Ironically, the Saskatchewan government passed legislation 15 or so years ago to implement carbon credit trading, but they never implemented it into law. So we haven't been able in Saskatchewan to benefit from that. But I think we got to look at it and say no-till is good. It's good for the soil, good for the future, but we have the emissions side of the equation that we probably have to take a closer look at and work through some of these best management practices. And I would suggest for growers to take a look. There's a agriculture and agri-food document that came out in March of this year that's called Discussion Document, Reducing Emissions Arising from the Application of Fertilizer in Canada's Agriculture Sector. And just take a look at it. Don't go in there with biases. Go in there with an open mind and look at the best management practices that they have laid out there and say, yeah, I'm doing this, or yeah, that would maybe fit on my farm.
Well, Thom, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been great.
Perfect.
Rebels, thanks for listening today. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, be sure to join us on our brand new Facebook group page, The Rebellion Brewing Podcast. I'm going to include links to all of Thom Weir's articles in the show notes. Be sure to check it out. I'm also proud to let you know that we're members of the Saskatchewan Podcast Network. It's a one-stop shop for tons of locally produced shows from across our province. You can find them at saskpodcastnetwork.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Untapped so you don't miss out on the latest in Sask craft beer news. Thank you for joining the Rebellion.